Yahweh demanded extravagant offerings while the Israelites ate manna for decades. God requires detailed and often costly sacrifices, the finest lambs, goats, and bulls without blemish, as well as offerings of wine, oil, and grains. Leviticus 1-7. During festivals, such as Passover and the Feast of Tabernacles, the offerings are extensive and often require significant resources. Numbers 28-29. While the Israelites are eating manna, a monotonous, basic sustenance, this contrast might seem odd, especially considering the Israelites had no stable economy or farmlands in the wilderness. Requiring sacrifices from people already struggling in the wilderness seems excessive. Offering high-quality animals might have been particularly burdensome, especially when survival itself was difficult. A deeper critique is whether such expectations reflect a God of mercy or one who prioritizes ritual and grandeur over human welfare. This observation is not a joke but a genuine critique of the biblical narrative. The contrast between manna and lavish offerings can make Moses' God seem demanding, even indifferent to the people's suffering. Let's delve into the quail incident in Numbers 11, which highlights both the Israelites' complaints about manna and God's response. The quail incident. What happened? The Israelites grew tired of eating manna and began to complain bitterly. They longed for the variety of food they had in Egypt, saying, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. But now we have lost our appetite. We never see anything but this manna." Numbers 11, 4-6. Provision of quail. God promises to provide meat, not for one day, but for an entire month. You will eat it until it comes out of your nostrils and you loathe it. Numbers 11:20. This statement shows a mix of provision and punitive intent. God's tone is harsh, and his response seems less about satisfying a need and more about teaching a lesson. Quail arrives in abundance, falling around the camp in large quantities. Numbers 11:31. The people gather and begin eating. However, as they eat, God's anger burns against them, and many die from a plague, a punishment for their greed and lack of faith. Numbers 11:33-34. Provision with punishment. While God provides what the people ask for, meat, he does so with an apparent intent to punish them for their complaints. The phrase, "until it comes out of your nostrils," suggests a mockery of their desires, making the provision seem punitive rather than merciful. Indifference to human suffering. The provision of manna, while miraculous, was ultimately a form of bare minimum sustenance. For 40 years, the Israelites lived on a monotonous, unvaried diet, which not only left them physically unsatisfied but also deprived them of the joy and dignity associated with food variety. When they expressed a natural, human desire for more, longing for the diverse foods they remembered from Egypt, Yahweh responded not with understanding, but with mockery and punishment. This lack of empathy for their suffering, coupled with his harsh reaction to their complaints, reveals a deity more concerned with maintaining authority than addressing the legitimate needs of his people. Ritual over compassion. At the same time the Israelites were struggling to survive in the wilderness, Yahweh demanded extravagant sacrifices of the finest livestock, grain, and wine. These sacrifices were not optional, they were commanded as acts of worship. Yet the resources required for these offerings were scarce and critical for the Israelites' own survival. Rather than prioritizing the well-being of his people, Yahweh placed greater importance on ritualistic displays of loyalty. The demand for perfection, unblemished animals and the finest offerings, underscored a focus on grandeur and ceremony, even as his followers lived in deprivation. A truly compassionate deity would prioritize the welfare of his people over the display of ritualistic devotion. Does Yahweh's emphasis on sacrifice suggest love, or a need to assert dominance? Harshness is a ruling principle. Yahweh's responses to the Israelites' natural desires and complaints were often extreme, even cruel. When the Israelites asked for meat, Yahweh granted their request, but with a vindictive twist. He provided so much quail that it became overwhelming, then punished them with a plague for consuming it. This wasn't just provision, it was a calculated act to humiliate and punish. The message was clear: asking for more, even when justified, would be met with suffering. Similarly, their complaints about manna were framed as rebellion, deserving of divine retribution. Yet hunger, fatigue, and longing for variety are not sins, they are part of the human condition. By treating these needs as offenses, Yahweh ruled not with understanding or love, but with fear and disproportionate punishment. What kind of deity punishes people for simply expressing their natural human needs? Is this justice, or tyranny? The uncomfortable truth: when viewed critically, these actions suggest a deity whose priorities were not love, compassion, or justice, but power, control, and submission. By enforcing suffering for basic human desires, demanding costly sacrifices from a struggling people, and responding to complaints with overwhelming punishment, Yahweh's actions appear to reflect a ruler who governs through fear rather than care. Does a truly benevolent God punish hunger? Can a deity demanding ritual over relief be called compassionate? Should fear be the foundation of faith?